August 2024, a research boat idles on a stretch of the Illinois River about 50 miles from Lake Michigan. A team from the University of Illinois lowers cages of young silver carp into the water and waits. Within hours, the fish stop moving. They don't die. They don't swim away. They just go still, hovering in place like they've been drugged. The scientists already suspected something was holding the carp back from reaching the Great Lakes, but nobody expected the answer to look like this. Not a predator, not a wall, not a chemical. Something the city of Chicago had been dumping into its own river for a century, completely by accident. And somewhere underneath that discovery is a warning, because the thing suppressing one of the most destructive invasive species in American history isn't a permanent fix. It's a fragile accident that could break the moment the water gets cleaner or the money runs dry, and if it breaks, 40 million people who drink from the Great Lakes could be looking at an ecological collapse that no amount of money can undo. To understand how urgent this actually is, you have to go back more than 50 years to a decision nobody thought twice about at the time. In the early 1970s, catfish farmers across the American South had a problem. Their aquaculture ponds kept clogging with algae, choking the water and killing their stock. Someone had an idea. Import a fish from China that eats algae and plankton nonstop, drop a few into every pond, and let biology do the cleaning. It worked exactly as planned. Silver carp and bighead carp, later joined by grass carp and black carp, were brought into the United States and put to work as living filtration systems. For a while, that's all they were, a farming tool contained inside private ponds in Arkansas and Mississippi. Then came the flooding. Heavy rains in the 1970s and 1980s overwhelmed containment ponds across the South, and the carp got out into the open water of the Mississippi River Basin. Nobody sounded an alarm because nobody understood yet what these fish were capable of. Within about a decade, they were breeding freely in the wild. From the Mississippi, they pushed into tributary after tributary, and by the 1990s, they had found their way into the Illinois River, a waterway that runs almost in a straight shot from the middle of the state up into Chicago, connecting through man-made canals directly into Lake Michigan. Here's why that geography terrifies biologists. The Illinois waterway was never supposed to connect two separate watersheds. It exists because Chicago, over 100 years ago, reversed the flow of the Chicago River to send its sewage away from Lake Michigan and down toward the Mississippi instead. That engineering marvel solved a public health crisis in the 1900s, but it also carved open a corridor between two of the largest freshwater systems on the planet, a corridor that had never existed in nature. Asian carp didn't have to evolve a way around a mountain range or a waterfall. Humans built them a highway. It's worth understanding that Asian carp is actually shorthand for 4 separate species that arrived through the same accidental door: silver carp, bighead carp, grass carp, and black carp. Grass carp target aquatic vegetation and can strip a wetland bare within a single growing season, wiping out the plant cover that native fish use for spawning and shelter. Black carp specialize in snails and native mussels, some of which are already endangered, meaning their spread threatens to finish off species that decades of conservation work were trying to save. But it's silver and bighead carp, the plankton eaters, that dominate the Illinois River today and drive most of the panic, because their feeding strategy hits the food web at its most vulnerable point, the very bottom, where the damage cascades upward through every single species above it. Once they were in the Illinois River, the carp exploited a design flaw in the food chain that nothing native had prepared for. A silver carp swims with its mouth open, straining plankton directly out of the water in massive, continuous gulps. That's the same plankton every native fish species depends on at the base of the food web, from the tiniest fry, just hatched, to the shad and minnows that everything else eats. The carp gets there first, and everything above it in the chain starts to starve slowly. Scientists tracking gizzard shad populations in the Illinois River watched them collapse as carp biomass rose, and because bass, catfish, and other sport fish depend on shad, the entire river's food economy started running on empty. The reproductive numbers alone should have been the first red flag. A single female silver carp can release hundreds of thousands of eggs in one spawning season, and under the right conditions, over 1 million. There's no realistic scenario where a slow-growing native predator keeps pace with that kind of biological output. Within a couple of decades, silver and bighead carp had become the dominant species by weight in long stretches of the Illinois River, in some sections accounting for as much as 70% of all living biomass in the water. Researchers doing population surveys near Starved Rock started recording densities exceeding 12,000 carp per kilometer of river. Pull a net anywhere along that stretch, and what comes up is carp, 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 with maybe one gasping native fish caught in the pile as an afterthought. And then there's the part that turned this from an ecological story into a public safety story. Silver carp have a bizarre, almost unbelievable defense reaction. The vibration from an outboard boat motor sends them into a panic, and they launch themselves clean out of the water, sometimes 10 feet into the air, weighing anywhere from 5 to 20 pounds. Picture cruising down the river at 30 miles an hour and having a fish the size of a bowling ball come rocketing at your skull with no warning. Wildlife agencies in Illinois maintain documented injury records from these encounters. Black eyes, broken noses, concussions, fractured ribs, deep lacerations from the carp's fins. Boaters have been knocked flat, thrown off balance, and in some documented cases, knocked unconscious in their own boats by a fish they never even saw coming. For families on the river, this isn't background trivia. It's a genuine physical hazard every single time a motor starts. But the real nightmare scenario was always Lake Michigan. If Asian carp established a breeding population inside the Great Lakes, biologists warned the damage wouldn't stop at annoying boaters. It would mean the same collapse happening on a vastly larger scale, plankton stripped from the base of the food web, followed by the small fish that feed on it, followed by the salmon, lake trout, whitefish, and yellow perch that anchor a fishery worth more than $5 billion and support tens of thousands of jobs across 8 states and 2 countries. Layer on top of that the drinking water supply for more than 40 million people who rely on the Great Lakes, and you start to understand why this fish became a matter of interstate and even international concern rather than a regional fishing nuisance. The government's first response was to try and physically stop the fish with brute force engineering. In 2002, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers activated an electric dispersal barrier in the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, roughly 37 miles from Lake Michigan, sending pulses of electricity through the water designed to turn fish back without killing them or blocking barge traffic. It helped, but it was never airtight, and biologists kept finding environmental DNA, tiny genetic traces shed by fish on the Lake Michigan side of the barrier, which meant something was still getting through, even if researchers couldn't always catch a live fish to prove it. That uncertainty is what eventually produced the most expensive single answer to this problem: the Brandon Road Interbasin Project near Joliet, Illinois. Engineers designed it as a layered gauntlet at a natural choke point in the waterway, combining underwater sound deterrents, bubble curtains, electric barriers, and a flushing lock system meant to physically wash any fish that got close back downstream. The projected price tag eventually landed north of $1 billion, split between federal and state funding, and even that number kept climbing as the design was finalized. And in the years since it was approved, the project has been anything but smooth. Illinois had to acquire dozens of acres of land just to give the Army Corps legal access to the site, a process that dragged into 2025. Then came a string of federal funding disruptions. Construction paused for administrative review at the start of 2026, resumed that spring after pressure from Great Lakes governors, and then in the summer of 2026, the Army Corps issued another stop work order, even with contractors already on site and shaft drilling scheduled to begin. Congressional representatives from both parties have written letters demanding the project restart, warning that every month of delay is a month the carp get closer for free. As of now, Brandon Road is still not finished, still not guaranteed, and still vulnerable to the next political funding fight. Illinois has effectively been building a $1 billion wall against a fish that keeps breeding faster than anyone can pour concrete. While politicians and engineers argued over barriers, a much more emotionally satisfying idea was taking hold in the public imagination. The idea that nature already had a weapon sitting right there in the water, one that had simply been forgotten. That weapon was the alligator gar, a native fish that once patrolled these same rivers and had all but vanished from Illinois by the mid-20th century. The alligator gar is not a subtle animal. It can grow past 8 feet long and exceed 300 pounds, making it one of the largest freshwater fish in North America, surpassed only by the white sturgeon. It has a long, alligator-like snout lined with 2 rows of needle-sharp teeth, thick, diamond-shaped armored scales instead of typical fish skin, and a lineage that stretches back roughly 100 million years, meaning these fish were swimming through prehistoric rivers alongside dinosaurs. For most of American history, though, people didn't see a living fossil worth protecting. They saw an ugly, toothy nuisance that tangled nets and scared swimmers, and they treated it accordingly, shooting them, netting them out, and leaving carcasses to rot on riverbanks. Add in decades of levee and dam construction that sealed off the shallow, vegetated backwaters gar need to spawn, and the species simply had nowhere left to reproduce in Illinois. The last wild alligator gar caught in the state was pulled from the water in 1966. By 1994, Illinois officially classified the species as extirpated, completely gone from the state, though populations still survived farther south. In the late 1990s, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service began experimenting with hatchery-raised alligator gar as part of a broader native species restoration effort, and Illinois joined the program, releasing young gar back into the rivers where their ancestors once lived. The timing turned out to be almost cinematic. Around 2010, right as Asian carp populations in the Illinois River were exploding into the tens of thousands per mile, the state was simultaneously reintroducing the largest predatory fish in its history into that exact same water. People connected the dots instantly, and in 2016, Illinois lawmakers went on record identifying the alligator gar as the one native fish potentially large enough to swallow an adult Asian carp. The story wrote itself, an ancient armored predator rising from the past to devour the invaders threatening the Great Lakes. There was just one problem. The people who actually managed the gar reintroduction program had been saying the opposite for years, and almost nobody was listening. Dan Stevenson, who ran fisheries programs for the Illinois Department of Natural Resources and personally oversaw the gar stocking, told reporters repeatedly that the reintroduction was never designed as an Asian carp control strategy. It never had been. The entire point was ecological restoration, bringing back a native species that had been wiped out and giving anglers the chance to catch a genuine freshwater giant again. He put it about as plainly as a scientist can put anything, stating outright that the gar would have essentially no effect on Asian carp populations. That quote rarely made it into headlines. The math backs him up completely. Between 2010 and 2013, Illinois stocked roughly 6,000 alligator gar into its waters. Most died young, as is typical for a slow-growing, late-maturing species, and only around 1,500 survived, long enough to reach a meaningful size in the wild. Spreading 1,500 predators across hundreds of miles of river is nowhere near enough to make a dent in a carp population, numbering in the millions. And even a fully grown alligator gar has a physical limitation that no amount of enthusiasm can overcome. Adult silver carp can weigh well over 10 pounds, and a gar's mouth, despite being lined with teeth, simply cannot open wide enough to swallow a fish that size. Gar can realistically only prey on carp during their first few months of life, before the carp outgrows the threat entirely and swims off safe for the rest of its lifespan. Biologists said this consistently for years. A National Wire story about the reintroduction still ran with a headline framing the JR as the weapon that could reclaim the river, and it spread to papers across the country. The public latched onto the version with the ancient monster hero, because a boring, technical answer about mouthgape limitations and juvenile mortality rates was never going to compete with a story about a 100-million-year-old predator coming home for revenge. But here's the twist that makes this story genuinely strange. The carp near Starved Rock really were disappearing. Population surveys showed real, measurable declines year after year in that stretch of river. The gar theory was wrong, but the outcome people wanted was actually happening, just for two completely different reasons, and neither one had anything to do with a predator with teeth. The first reason has a paycheck attached to it. Illinois started offering commercial fishermen an incentive of about 10 cents per pound over market rate, specifically for pulling Asian carp out of the water. Over roughly 15 years, that incentive dragged more than 50 million pounds of carp out of the Illinois River alone, and when you count every waterway across the state combined, the total climbs to nearly 78 million pounds removed. That is not a hobby fishery. That's an industrial-scale harvesting operation, and the crews running it borrowed a technique straight from Chinese commercial fishing traditions called the unified method. Boats first wall off a section of river with netting, then line up at the far end and start pounding on their hull, using the exact panic response that makes silver carp launch into the air as a weapon against them. The noise drives the fish forward into a tightening trap thousands at a time, until the crews can lift entire schools out in a single haul. One operation on the Illinois River reportedly pulled 750,000 pounds of carp in one single netting. Crews have also adopted a tactic nicknamed Judas Fish, tagging a handful of carp with radio transmitters and releasing them back into the river, knowing the social schooling behavior of the species means the tagged fish will lead crews straight back to the rest of the pack every time. Then Illinois tried something even stranger, attacking the demand side of the problem by rebranding the fish itself. The biology was never the issue with carp as food. Silver carp eat only plankton, never touch bottom sediment or mud, and the meat tests out white, mild, and lower in mercury than most fish sold in American grocery stores. The problem was purely psychological. Say the word carp to an American consumer, and they picture a slimy bottom feeder, and no amount of nutritional data was changing that association. So in 2022, the state spent roughly $600,000 on a rebranding campaign, giving the fish an entirely new commercial name, Coppy, short for copious, a nod to how abundant the fish actually is. Chefs across Illinois started putting Coppy tacos, Coppy burgers, and Coppy fillets on menus, and the state projected the rebrand could help pull around 12 million pounds of fish out of the water in its first year. 2 months in, harvest numbers had already blown past 10 million pounds, suggesting the marketing push was doing exactly what removal crews alone couldn't do fast enough. The removal effort didn't stop at nets and menus either. Fisheries crews began using environmental DNA sampling as an early warning system, testing water for microscopic traces of carp genetic material to map exactly how far the population had spread without needing to catch a single fish. That same eDNA technology is what let scientists confirm carp presence near the electric barrier years before a live fish was ever pulled from that stretch of water. And it remains the backbone of the entire monitoring program watching the approach to Lake Michigan today. Combine the removal numbers with the rebrand and the picture becomes clear. This was never one silver bullet. It was dozens of overlapping, unglamorous tactics stacked on top of each other, run by biologists and fishermen who rarely got credit for outperforming a monster fish story. That's the first force nobody put on a poster, a bounty system and a rebranding campaign quietly outfishing a mythical predator. The second force is even stranger, because nobody engineered it on purpose at all. For more than a decade, carp advancing up the Illinois River toward Lake Michigan hit an invisible wall roughly 50 miles from the lake and simply stalled there. Researchers already had a clue something unusual was happening, because earlier genetic studies had found carp captured near Chicago, showing clear biological stress markers, the kind of cellular stress response associated with living in contaminated water. In 2024, a team at the University of Illinois, led by researcher Corey Susky, decided to test that idea directly. They collected water samples from the polluted stretch of river where carp movement consistently stalled, then introduced young silver carp into tanks filled with that water under controlled lab conditions. In clean water, juvenile carp behaved exactly as expected, actively exploring their environment, feeding, moving normally. In the contaminated water samples, the young carp went sluggish almost immediately, activity levels dropping sharply within a short period of exposure. The explanation traces back to over a century of industrial and municipal history concentrated in that one stretch of waterway. Decades of sewage discharge, road salt runoff, and industrial pollution have accumulated in the water approaching Chicago. And while none of it is concentrated enough to outright kill an adult carp, it creates a physiological cost that makes every hour spent in that water more metabolically expensive. Fish exposed to it have to divert energy toward basic survival and detoxification instead of growth, feeding, or reproduction. And over time, that trade-off becomes enough of a deterrent that populations simply stop pushing forward. The carp aren't being blocked by force. They're being discouraged by an environment that makes continued advancement not worth the biological cost. In effect, Chicago accidentally built the most effective anti-carp barrier in the entire system, not through billion-dollar engineering, but through 100 years of pollution nobody was trying to weaponize. That accidental front line has held remarkably well. Since monitoring began, only a small handful of individual carp have ever been confirmed past that stalling point. Isolated catches in 2010, 2017, and 2022, each one recovered within roughly 7 to 11 miles of Lake Michigan itself. Every time, response crews launched intensive follow-up searches, and every time, they found no evidence of an established breeding population making it through. Single fish, never a foothold. It's an extraordinary track record for a defense system nobody designed and nobody controls. It also puts Illinois in an almost impossible position. Every dollar spent cleaning up the Chicago waterway, reducing sewage overflows, cutting industrial discharge, restoring oxygen levels for the sake of public health and other native species, is a dollar that theoretically makes the water more hospitable for the exact fish everyone is trying to keep out. Environmental regulators aren't about to stop cleaning up a river that runs through a major American city just to keep a chemical barrier intact, which means the state is racing to finish Brandon Road before its own environmental progress quietly opens the door it worked so hard to keep shut. And that is precisely why scientists describe this discovery as terrifying rather than reassuring. Everything currently holding invasive carp back from Lake Michigan is fragile in a way that a real barrier wouldn't be. Brandon Road, the permanent purpose-built defense, remains unfinished, tangled in funding disputes that have paused and restarted construction multiple times just in the past 2 years. The commercial harvesting program depends entirely on continued government incentive payments, and those grant dollars have themselves been paused pending federal review, which means the moment funding dries up, boats stop going out and pressure on the carp population eases immediately. Meanwhile, decades of environmental cleanup efforts around Chicago's waterways, worthwhile and necessary as they are for public health, are slowly making that polluted stretch of river cleaner. Every improvement in water quality chips away at the one thing that has been quietly holding the invasion line for years. Clean up the water enough, and the invisible chemical wall that has stalled Asian carp for over a decade could simply dissolve, opening a clear, energetically comfortable path straight into Lake Michigan. Layer on top of that the fact that a single female silver carp can still release over 1 million eggs in one season, and you have a population that is one funding lapse away from surging back toward the lake at full strength. Pull the commercial nets out of the water for even a season or two, and biologists warn the carp populations in the lower Illinois River could rebound aggressively, undoing years of harvest progress almost overnight. And the alligator gar, despite never being the predator people wanted it to be, is still quietly spreading. Illinois continues stocking it annually, and gar are increasingly turning up on anglers' lines across their historic range. A genuine native species success story, just not the one that was advertised, and not one capable of stopping what's coming from downstream. So the actual answer to what's been killing Asian carp near Starved Rock turns out to be a combination nobody wanted to put on a poster. A cash bounty program that turned commercial fishermen into an industrial removal force, a marketing campaign that convinced people to eat their way through millions of pounds of an invasive species, and a century of accidental industrial pollution that made the final stretch of river toward Lake Michigan too metabolically costly for young carp to bother crossing. Not a monster fish with prehistoric teeth. Not yet a finished billion-dollar engineering marvel. A paycheck, a dinner menu, and Chicago's own filth, working together by pure coincidence to hold back one of the most destructive invasive species in North American history. Great Lakes states have watched invasive species disasters play out before and know exactly how fast the damage compounds once a species gets a foothold. Zebra mussels, another accidental import, colonized the Great Lakes decades ago and have cost the region billions of dollars in clogged water intakes and altered ecosystems ever since, with no realistic way to remove them once established. Biologists warn that Asian carp becoming self-sustaining inside Lake Michigan wouldn't just be a repeat of that story, it would be worse, because carp sit so much closer to the base of the food chain that the ripple effects would touch nearly every commercially and recreationally important species the lakes support. The people who actually understood this told the truth for years, and it rarely made the headlines, because a fish tale about an ancient armored predator coming home for revenge will always beat a story about pollution chemistry and bounty economics. But understanding the real story matters now more than ever, because every one of the forces actually holding this invasion back is temporary, underfunded, or actively being cleaned away. And the moment any one of them fails, the fish that once made up 70% of the biomass in the Illinois River will have a clear, comfortable path into the largest freshwater system on the planet,